So welcome to this another awakening conversation. And today I have my wonderful best friend of 26 years, probably plus, and ABC journalist of how many years, Kum?
Oh gosh, on and off for 20 something years, but this last stint like 10.
Yeah.
Nuts.
So welcome, Kumi Taguchi.
Hi, Sara. So
great to have this conversation that's actually going to be public, because we have so many amazing conversations.
Yeah.
And learn so much from each other constantly. I mean, we talk fairly regularly, and throughout our conversations, we're always like, oh yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of nice to have like in the public domain.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. So today we'll talk about how I think, like I'm doing this series on how COVID's affecting us and what we can do to kind of help ourselves through this time. And I wanted to talk to you about media and how the different types of media affect us. And, and I mean, we'll kind of start there, I guess, and then how like different tools that you've learned because of being in this kind of space for such a long time of how not to get too stressed and how not to get too into the stories, so we can actually just stay in a better position of health and mental health.
Yeah, the constant information thing is so hard to manage these days. And I've often thought, we forget that the phones that we all hold in our hands came out in 2007, the iPhone. And it wasn't until a couple of years after that we really started using apps and being constantly connected to news. So it's really only been 10 years of this kind of constant news connection. And there's no doubt about it that that affects our ability to feel like we can disconnect from what's going on around us. Absolutely no doubt about it. There's also an interesting correlation between, if you look at election cycles in Australia, there's been more leadership spills since the iPhone came out.
Oh, wow.
Prior to that. Yeah, so it's quite interesting when you start to correlate stuff like, because you think about Twitter or you think about the speed of which news now can happen. There'll be a little scandal or the hint of a scandal, then 3 hours later a politician standing up, and then 5 hours later they've sacked. Whereas pre-Twitter or pre-phone, that kind of cycle would never really be that known about, So that's something I always think about when I think of the effect of these phones and the connectivity on our lives. When I think of politics, but then when you think of something like COVID, that first month was just 24 hours a day, pretty much everything you saw was facts, stats, what you can do, what you can't do, rules, boundaries, and that doesn't allow much space for how we're feeling, in that space.
Well, two things out of that I want to dive into a little bit more. One is you mentioned something in one of our kind of private conversations about a Southeast Asian country. It could have been Philippines or Vietnam or one of those, and not recording any cases of COVID. Do you remember?
Vietnam. So they didn't have any deaths. They had some cases, but they were quickly eradicated. January. So we, here in Australia, I think we really started thinking about it February, and then March was the critical time. January was the critical time for Vietnam. I didn't know this, though, until I started looking into it, thinking what's happening in other places and what's been going on. And you think Vietnam's a kind of developing nation. There's this notion that, developed nations can get on top of things quicker and have better health systems and cleaner and all that kind of stuff. But Vietnam got onto it really early, had 3 testing systems in place by January. They've had no deaths. It's not like it's a wealthy country.
But then like the believability of that, right?
Yeah, and then some people did start to question the believability. So you've got to dig into that stuff and go, are the stats that we're hearing correct? Who's putting out those statistics? And a journalist I spoke to said that, in general, the Vietnamese government can sort of have a message style system, and so sometimes you've got to wonder whether a lot of the facts are actually true. But it's such a community space, and Vietnamese people are so community minded, and everyone has phones. And she sort of said, look, if there was anything being covered up, or if there were bodies being taken to hospitals and we weren't told about it, or if there were people being sick and taken away in ambulances, but it was hundreds, not dozens, it would be recorded. The kind of WhatsApp messaging system of the community would have picked up that the facts weren't actually true to what was happening on the ground. So
and just spread it through social media. So it just
totally.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating when you said that the other day. It's like, if it wasn't believable, there'd be so much stuff on social media about that.
Exactly, and it's not like a country like China where social media is, say, blocked and information you can't get out, and so you can't dispute the narrative that's being sold to you. But social media, like places like Vietnam, Africa, is just so massive. It's nearly like a check system for information. It's like a kind of like, well, do we really believe it? What's actually everyone really saying, and what's actually everyone really taking photos of right now?
Well, the other thing I wanted to talk about when you were just talking before is that kind of not being able to take a break from that news feed. And imagine, like, I think it was about 3 years ago when you were doing daily news, you were doing nightly or all afternoon news.
Yeah.
Like, how is that? And you're not doing that anymore, but how would you feel, and how would you, because I know, like, when you report, you are so in it, like you are so in the story. And so if you kind of wind back to then as if what was going on now, how do you reckon you'd be feeling?
That's such a good thing to imagine. It would be the only thing that was dominating my thoughts right now. I would know every fact and figure. I would know every nuance of what happened when. There's something kind of exciting about seeing a story unfold, minuscule by minuscule by minuscule. But it would be the dominant thing in my mind, as in the fear of it, the stats of it, the wonder about it. Now, there's still fear and there's still wonder and there's still confusion and sort of like, where is this all going to go and how are we all going to end up? But it doesn't feel to me as
assuming the only thing.
Yeah, as the only thing. Like it's and if you look at repetition, I've thought about this a lot in my industry. So daily news is very repetitive, especially if you're doing 3-hour shifts. Like there's a model in which you have to subscribe to, which is you read headlines every quarter of the hour, because the concept is that someone switches on the TV and in 15 minutes they need to know what's going on, right? So newsreader, if you times that by 3 hours, that means that by the time you've finished a shift, as well as doing all the interviews and intros to the same story, you're reading the same headlines. What's that? 4 times an hour, 12 times at least, the same words. This many people have died, this many people in hospital, this many.
Imagine what that does to your nervous system. That's like repetitive negative self-talk. That's
exactly. It's like it has to have, and sometimes after the end of a week, and if it was a full-on story, I think my brain is actually going slightly mad, like as in you can't repeat stuff to your brain all the time without it having some effect, and it's got to have some effect on how you perceive the world. So a lot of us in the sort of news business, you'll go through these ups and downs of kind of feeling hopeless about the world, helplessness. There's nothing you can do to help, solve, fix. No amount of your reporting it's making it any better, so it's a really difficult kind of space to manage for sure.
Well, I kind of manage my news coverage and my stress levels. Like the first few days, going back a couple of months, I felt like fear and stress and I didn't want to be part of the problem. And so, as a practitioner, I had to decide on whether I was going to continue working. I was considered essential services, so I could potentially work, but I also needed to sit back and think about what I thought was best for my patients if I was potentially carrying it and not knowing. I didn't want to be like part of the cycle of the problem.
Yeah.
And so that was a good couple of days, but I was watching it a lot, and it affects your adrenal system. And what kind of happens for people that don't know is it's like, if you it's like our kind of oldest parts of our brain, which are all to do with survival. It's if you sense something dangerous, then we get this big adrenaline and cortisol surge into our system, which makes us all ready to, increases our heart rate and our blood pressure, so our muscles are ready to fight and run, fight or run. So we're kind of in that position of like, what do I do? And then you're looking for, so there's a bit of a freeze that happens. So if you imagine like an impala in Africa, and it's just sitting there quietly eating grass, and it senses a lion in the grass. It will stop and freeze. And then that's when the surge happens. It's all getting ready. And then it's looking for more information. So it's looking for, like, is there a predator here? Where is the predator? What am I going to do? And that's kind of then what we go to the news for. So it's like, you know, at first it's like this, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then it's like we want more information so we can work out what we're going to do on a primal basis. But we actually never get the answers that we're looking for to decide what we're going to do.
No, and the problem with COVID is that there are no answers, right?
Yeah.
So the problem is that you can look for the information and you can know the stats and you can know what's happened that day, but at the end of the day, it's not going to solve the big questions. How's this going to help us? How will we be living in 3 months, 6 months' time? Will my kids be going to school or not? Will there be a second wave? No one knows. So that makes such sense. Like, that's really interesting to think about in that space. And like at the first few weeks, I was in that kind of like, what does this all mean mode? And I had to rethink my whole kind of year of work. You know, shoots were cancelled. We couldn't travel. We couldn't do anything. And so I came up with this. I felt there was a need actually within that space of constant news that our audiences needed a kind of live touch point every day for a space like you and I would chat if you came over for a cup of tea, and we'd be saying, oh my God, what's happening and what does this mean for our lives? I wanted to create that space. So we did this show on Instagram Live. But one of the things I want to talk about that was a really safe kind of space where people could be vulnerable, our guests, me, our audience, and really kind of express what was going on in our lives at the time. And in order to present that, so maybe the kind of work that you had to do in order to sort of think about how you wanted to run your clinic and how you wanted to be present for your clients, but also, you know, figure out what your safety areas were and all that kind of stuff. In order to do the show well justice, in order to provide that safe space, I made a rule for myself that I would watch the news at 9 in the morning and I'll just get my head around what was going on. You know, if there were massive long unemployment queues, it would be a little bit insensitive for me not to kind of be conscious of that for my show, right? But I'm not the news, so I'm not reporting on the unemployment queues. So the only reason I'd switch on the news was to kind of get a sense of what the big thing that day was happening. And then I made a rule that after 10 a.m., my show wasn't until 3:30 p.m. But this is how much that stuff can affect your sense of safety and your sense of centeredness. I would switch off the news, I'd put on music, and I'd kind of at first feel a bit guilty that I wasn't knowing what was going on. And I thought, but no, hang on. My job right now is not to know all the facts. That's someone else is doing that and other people are doing that really, 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 really well. My job is actually to provide a space that's away from that. But in order to do that, I had to actually physically cut myself off from the news before I did the show. It was a conscious decision to do it.
Yeah, well, I went even more extreme than that. I would watch it on Sunday nights to find out what was happening the next week. And then I was missing Sunday nights and I couldn't even find it sometimes. And I was like, oh, Mum, you know, do you know what, if there's anything lifted this week or, you know, what's happening for the next, I just needed the summary of it.
Yes.
Because, you know, when you think about like what that does to your adrenal system, it's like you can't actually live in that state of like fearing that lion for months.
Yeah, right. So what would happen over months if you lived like that? Would your body just shut down? Would you burn out?
Yeah, you will. No, well, it depends on your general level of stress before that. I mean, we can actually last pretty well on high stress situations for a fairly long time. It's just not good for us, you know. Like it affects heart rate, blood pressure for starters. So if you're at risk of cardiovascular disease, that's not a good situation to be in. It'll change your sleep patterns. Especially if you're looking at on your phone at night, you know, like especially, or if you've got loved ones and you're, you know, that are at risk or anything and you're trying to get as much information as possible, all you're doing is fearing the worst constantly. So it'll change your blood sugar, it'll, you know, change your oxygenation level, it changes a lot of things and just slowly breaks down your body. If you've got any little niggles, it amplifies it because it's adrenaline is pro-inflammatory and cortisol is pro-inflammatory over time. So it'll make little niggles much worse. There's lots of, you know, tension in your muscles because you're kind of ready to go all the time. It's not like going into that relaxed state. So it's not good for us at all. And if we're also looking for like the answers on the outside with this whole COVID thing, like you said before, we're actually not going to get it. So really, I think the trick is it's like managing that, like how we receive our news and how much we expose ourselves to it. And like I think you were saying when we're having another private conversation, it's like some people need the information. So you might need the information to feel safe and secure, but just be very aware of where that point is, because you're probably not going to get the answers you need, except the practical things for the next week or whatever. So it's like knowing when that kind of isn't being fulfilled and you're going into more of the stress response.
Yeah.
And that's the time that we need to go internal, I think. And one of your guests on Couple with Kumi one day, I can't remember who it was, but we are lucky enough in Australia to be kind of coming out of restrictions. And I'd like to talk about other parts of the world after this, but we're very fortunate. We're we've been allowed to, even under lockdown, we've been allowed to go outside and exercise and have those lifestyle things which are really healthy for us. And, coming out of lockdown, in one of your interviews, he said, it's like being on retreat. We've retreated from the world and we've blocked a lot of the stimulation and the noise and the rush and all that kind of stuff. And it's like if you've done a meditation or retreat, when you come out, it's like you can't even talk sometimes. I don't know if you kind of experienced that. I've run meditation courses and, it's like time to come out and everyone comes out and you have to talk really slowly, really quietly, and no one can talk at that point. No one can talk because you've got to kind of integrate and just slowly come out into the world. And I think that's really important because otherwise it's too overstimulating.
Totally. And you've kind of gone back to a very simple way of being, and your kind of energy of rushing from one thing to the next and meeting to the next and having a chat with the barista and then getting to work and then managing this and grabbing groceries and getting to that appointment at the salon or whatever, all that was taken away. And I think for a lot of people initially that was challenging, but I think a lot of people found some kind of sense of kind of peace and quiet in that space. And maybe we realized that we didn't have to fill our diaries all the time. They didn't have to be jam-packed. We could allow space. And a lot of us aren't comfortable with nothingness, A lot of us aren't comfortable with not having that appointment in the diary. You know me well. I like to sort of have things planned and what's happening next and what's happening next and what's happening next. So I think it depends so much on your personality type, how much information you need. And the interesting thing I've always come to a conclusion about the information is that when something's major that's going to affect our lives, you will find out. Like, if the government says we've got to go back into lockdown or the schools are closed or you can't have more than 10 people again, we've got to retract, or you can now travel overseas to these places, that message will be so clearly given and amplified, whether it's through news or some social media thing or your friends or your network of people, that that sort of urgency for knowing, because you might miss out. So this is the other thing that I think is really interesting, is there's a mirror. For those of us who want information to feel like we're in some kind of control, we get the information. The problem with that is, even when you know that you might have enough and you think, I've got to step back, people can feel really anxious, even if it's for that 2 hours of leaving their phone off, not looking at the news, not checking Twitter, going for a walk, of going, what if I've missed out on something? What if I've missed some key piece of information that I needed to know? So this is a massive issue when you're in the 24-hour news business. It took me a long time to sort of switch off after a shift, because I'm like, but I need to know what's happening now for my shift tomorrow. There's no end to it. So in fact, the switching off part and the anxiety for a lot of people about thinking they're missing out on something, I think is a massive thing as well.
I've also thought about, like how media generally, people talk about it a lot. People don't report the good things in the media. They report the bad things in the media, but they do that for a reason. And part of it is like, it's the human condition and that is looking for the negative stuff, so we can be on alert. It's like, is it dangerous? Is it dangerous? Is it dangerous? So we're always looking for the the threats that might be there in terms of on a basic kind of human level. And so because of that, we're looking for it. So that it's fed to us in that negative light, which then drives our adrenal systems. But I also feel like it's a way of controlling us. So it's like if they were to go, you know, oh yeah, COVID's around and look, we want you to stay, it's okay. You know, like it is killing people and it's highly contagious, but it's okay. We don't want you to panic. And these are the things, these are the rules. So you're not allowed to be in a proximity of 1.5 meters. You're not allowed to be closer than that. And, you know, you need to wear a mask and you need to use sanitizer and you need to wash your hands a lot. And they said it like that. People would be like, oh yeah, whatever.
Right. So you're saying if it's delivered in a way that's kind of like, this is actually really bad, it could affect your life and people are going to die, people are going to act.
Yeah, exactly. Out of fear. It's like, this is like, I mean, I actually think that Australia was also fortunate because we had seen what was happening around the world. We had seen what was happening in America and Europe and, well, Italy first, you know, that this could potentially be really bad. So I think that was like a big thing for us, that we could see this was a reality, that we could also be in the same boat. So we had to be vigilant from the start. But if they'd kind of been gentle about it and like, don't panic and, you know, it's going to be okay and these are the things, like people just wouldn't follow the rules. But if it's like, you know, we're looking at, you know, thousands of people dying, we're looking at hospitals not being able to have, you know, respirators and not enough masks and not enough gowns and, you know, like, look at what's happening overseas, then we're going to actually go, okay, this is bad. I need to do something.
Yeah. And I think it's really cultural too. Like Aussies in general are kind of like, we're easygoing. We distrust authority a little bit. We're skeptical. We don't mind bending the rules a little bit. We think it's quite fun and we think it's quite funny to find ways around things. You know, Vietnam's a very different example. There's a real patriotism there. So a lot of the messaging was around stay home for your country, stay home for your country. And that's a message that really sells. It doesn't really sell in Australia necessarily, you know, stay home for the good of your country. Everyone's like, yeah, whatever, there's heaps of space and, you know, I want my business to keep going, whatever, you know. So I think, you know, it worked. You're right, it does change behaviour and it worked for us. It's a shame that it has to be fear that does that. But I've got to say for me, it really hit home that we were living in this lockdown world when I went up to the shops and everything was closed and I went to Woolies and I had to wait in a line and there were only two people allowed in, and the way in that actually really scared me. I thought, no, this is actually real. And you're right. I think if there hadn't have been the stories and the examples of, like, you know, at the same time we were kind of lining up outside Woolies and only two of us were allowed in at the time, there were images coming from New York of massive trucks, you know, loading bodies onto these trucks and there's no space for them to be buried, you know. So for us as a country to have that knowledge that this is deeply uncomfortable, we don't like it, there's businesses going under, people are losing their jobs, we're fearful, everything about our lives has changed, but then you could look elsewhere and go, but hang on.
Yeah, I've got big shivers even just thinking about that. Yeah, totally. It was like, you know, it's like holding those two poles of, you know, what's happening in parts of our country and in other parts of the world is horrific. It's really horrific. And holding the pole of like being grateful that I'm okay and I can still go outside and exercise. And yes, I'm restricted, but relatively, you know, I'm okay.
Exactly. And I've wondered too whether, I haven't thought enough about this and I haven't come to a conclusion, but I've been contemplating what something like this means when it's global. So had this been something that just affected Australia or one other country, it's different. But when it's global, there's a strange thing that happens, as in all of us can't travel.
Yeah.
All of our businesses are affected. It's not like anyone's got away with not having it.
That's the interesting thing about it. It's like so non-discriminatory.
Yeah. And I think that's something really interesting about it, that that having that comparison enabled our behaviour to change, I think, much quicker and with much more urgency and acceptance, even though it was desperately uncomfortable, had it not been a global pandemic. Had it been local, or had, it's like, yeah, are they overreacting? Come on, surely it's not going to be that bad. I have a feeling that it would have been a little bit different.
I agree. I feel like if we hadn't had that example of what was happening, the reality of it, with our kind of chilled out, relaxed, oh yeah, no problems, it'll be fine.
She'll be right, mate.
Yeah, she'll be right, mate. Chuck a prawn on the barbie.
100%. 100%. The other thing I've really thought about is, again, Twitter and the iPhone. Like, I still think, we have to remind ourselves that these things have only been in our pockets for just over a decade, right? So what would have happened? How would this have played out had there not have been Twitter, the internet?
Oh, the internet.
Information sharing. Our lives have changed. When you and I first went to uni, which was, a while ago, but it's not like that long ago, I remember there was like a computer lab where you could go in and use.
I remember you had that Apple computer, that big chunky one, and I was like, wow, I used to play Tetris on it. That was kind of my first computer game. Yeah, you owned a computer and you saved your money to buy that Mac.
Yeah, but there was no internet. It didn't log on.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I didn't even think of that.
It just did music stuff and graphic design or something. But, I don't think the pandemic would have been different, obviously, and how we responded to it on a scientific health level probably wouldn't have been different in terms of containment, stop the spread, all that kind of stuff. I think that general pandemic kind of behaviour from a scientific point of view wouldn't have changed. But I do think it would have played out differently. I don't know how.
Yeah.
But you imagine a pandemic pre the internet. I think, looking back at the plague or whatever was Spanish flu is too far back. Like, imagine a pandemic in the 1990 or when we're at uni. How would we have got the information? Would there be that sense of real fear? Yeah, I just think what would have the dynamic, how would have it felt differently? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think, in terms of, like, we would have still had mainstream media and the way they report. So we would have still been exposed that way. But I also feel like because I have my social media and it's like my filters on my social media, like I don't see anything that I don't want to see, really. I don't see any negative stuff that I don't want to see. I see stuff that I'm interested in. So it's like you can personalize it. I know a lot of people don't have this experience, but for me personally, like, my social media is all stuff I'm interested in and in quite a positive way. So if I didn't have that, I'd be watching more mainstream news and seeing stuff that that would stress me out and would make me feel helpless. And I have, like, the last few days, like this week driving to work, I've cried, like, on a number of occasions when I think about what's happening in America. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. But it is, again, like holding those two poles of, like, it's heartbreaking and I have gratitude for where I am. And I think, because of what's happening over there doesn't mean we can't enjoy our lives over here and be grateful for it, but we have to be able to hold that space. We can't pretend that it's not happening because it's very real. And it's not as if, I don't know if you want to go into this at all, Kum, but it's not as if we don't have the same history in Australia as they do in America. And Donald Trump, like, his lack of emotion and compassion for people generally has almost allowed him to lift up the carpet to all the dirt and crap that's under there that needs to be dealt with. Like, it can't go on. It can't go on like that.
No, and I think people at a certain point, there's always some revolution, right? You just hope something comes out of it. But I've often wondered that. I've often thought, it's funny, about a year or so ago, I was in a meeting in the office, and I can't remember what it was about. And I said, I can't remember what issue was burning at the time. I said, I feel like this can't go on the way in which our world is at the moment. And I can't remember what the issues were, but it was like there's got to be a tipping point. Like we all have a tipping point, right?
This is,
and I think that gratitude thing's really interesting, because one of the things I really noticed coming out of the COVID stuff was guilt, actually. So I was grateful for a job. I didn't lose my job. But there was a lot of survivor guilt happening. So a lot of people saying, I know I should be grateful, and I am grateful for what I have. I haven't lost a job. No one I know's died. At the very beginning in March, I remember thinking every single one of us will know of someone who dies of COVID. Now,
that's
it's
what I thought too.
Incredible that a lot of us don't.
I don't even know anyone who's actually tested positive yet.
No, it's absolutely incredible. And I was definitely thinking a lot of us haven't had that in our sphere, and we're all going to experience it, and we haven't. But there was definitely a lot of survivor guilt of kind of like, but the person next door's lost their business and all their jobs, or they're waiting on the Centrelink queue and I'm not, So there's something I think going on in this country too with the Black Lives Matter movement. It's like so much of the focus has been over in the US, and then, here we're saying, yeah, but what about focus on Indigenous Australians and, injustices there? And so one of the interesting things that's going to be really interesting to watch is that, will long-term change come out of all this? Look at Sandy Hook. When 6-year-old kids are gunned down in a school, I remember at the time, I think it was Barack Obama saying, if this does not change the way America thinks about guns, then nothing will. If 6-year-olds being slaughtered at school doesn't change America's attitude towards gun ownership or automatic guns, it's about automatic guns. It's not about gun ownership, it's about automatic rifles. So then what will? And one of my big fears around this stuff is that there's a momentum and there's a genuine societal desire for stuff to change. But
when people get comfortable again, is it going to be sustainable?
Yeah. And I always think of Sandy Hook, and I remember at that time thinking,
this has to change it.
What else is going to make it change when a little kindergarten kid's slaughtered? Nothing changed. And at that point, I remember feeling a deep sense of depression and hopelessness around activism, around protest, around the ability to make things change, because and around power, who holds really the power around choice. And so guns is a very interesting one because it's so different. No one's, but the activism is incredible to see, and the solidarity is incredible to see in the States. There's a bit going on here too in Australia. And I wonder in a month's time or 2 months' time what it'll look like.
It'll be interesting. I'm actually interviewing, a couple of astrologists around this, and, like their take on it is like there's so much planetary influence. Like I was talking to someone yesterday and she was saying soon, I think she said in about a month, there's some, I don't know my astrology well enough, but there's some sort of planetary influence which actually indicates the death of a king.
Oh, wow.
Which in terms here, like in our kind of lives, it's not really, those terms aren't probably quite accurate, but from a historical point of view.
It's talking about someone.
It's about to flip over, something's going to. So, so that's going to be really fascinating to see if there's all this kind of energetic stuff that's happening as well as what's happening in terms of the human lives. And
you talk about this a lot. I often think about this in terms of, so George Floyd, there was something about the way he died. I don't know if you've seen the 9-minute video, and if you haven't, I recommend you don't. Because I see it in my brain forever. But
I couldn't even work out what was going on at first. Like I didn't kind of know what I was watching, and I just go on and I'll.
But you've often spoken about these little messages that we're sent, right? The little taps. We don't listen to them, little taps, and then they get bigger and they get bigger and they get bigger, and then suddenly there's a massive big bash on your shoulder or your legs and you're filled, and it's kind of like, well, weren't you listening to the little signs? It's kind of like with stuff like this, I feel like the George Floyd, there's hundreds of people before George Floyd, right? There's hundreds of injustices. There's hundreds of kind of, that's not fair. trying to get some sense of justice. And then there's one thing that tips it over, and I've often wondered, why is it that one thing? One is it was recorded. So thank God for phones and media.
Yeah.
Two was the length of the kind of seeing this thing unfold and seeing people around him desperately trying to get things to change, like get your leg off his thing, he can't breathe. And I think for most people, the tip was him calling out for his mum. I've often thought what people do on their deathbed, people confess, they say that they regret something, they say to someone that they love, always love them, whatever it is, there's this need to kind of reach out to something that's primal to you and core to your sense of value and identity. And I think this big, strong, grown man calling out for his mother, to me, was the heartbreaking bit where I'm like, that is a man who is dying. Because at that point, he's like, mum.
He's gone back to like that.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, that was the tipping point. And the question now is, with that compassion, rage, sense of injustice, all the protests, what will actually change? Is there a law that's... See, the thing with gun control is interesting because there's a law that can be changed. There's a bit in the Constitution that can be changed. There's actually something you can point to and go, this little bit here, these words here, we want them taken out and changed. It's not massive, actually. It's words, votes, signatures. But with something like racial stuff, it's much more difficult because what are you trying to sign something out of law? Because
they actually, it's like actually confronting that there's an issue, for starters. It's actually it's actually saying, instead of like, no, we're not racist, African Americans can now vote. African Americans can now have jobs. I was listening to Brené Brown's kind of take on it. I don't know if you've heard that. It's really, really fantastic. It's a summary of white privilege and actually understanding what white privilege is. And she says things like, as a Caucasian woman, I can go to the supermarket and buy a doll that's the same colour skin as mine. I can buy a Band-Aid that's the same colour skin as mine. I can go to the shops and not worry if a policeman is going to pull me over for no reason. And if he did, it would be fine. It would be genuinely he needs to check something.
Yes.
That's what white privilege is. And she was also saying, which totally made sense, it's like actually confronting what's happening, which I think is something we need to do in Australia as well. It's like owning the story of slavery, owning the story of, what we've done to the Indigenous community a long time ago. But it's actually owning the story, otherwise the story owns you.
That's so interesting. I was actually listening to an Instagram live this morning of this actress, Reinhardt. I don't know if anyone knows her or any of your listeners know her. She's in this kind of pretty crappy thing called Riverdale, but she's been doing this stuff on her Instagram because she's got, 10 million followers or something. So she sees it as how can I help? I've got this platform, blah, 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 blah. I'm a white privileged person who has way too much money than I need is her sort of assessment of her own self. So she has been talking to these black activists the last couple of days. And I listened to one this morning of this guy who was ex-NFL player. He's now a sports broadcaster, black guy, really cool. And she was saying to him how she feels like she's got this platform where she can speak about this stuff or let black people come onto her platform and explain their story. And that's what her role is. And he said, no, actually, your role is more than that. He said, because she said, I don't feel as a white person that I have the right from my position of privilege to lead a conversation because I've never lived your experience. I don't know what it's like to be black. I've never been in your situation. He said, no, white people have held all the power. So white people have to also speak up. So there's this kind of really interesting thing about, I'm not black, I'm not Asian, I'm not whatever, I'm not a refugee, I'm not this, I'm not that. So do I have the right to speak for these people? And he was actually saying, you do and you should. And I think that's a really interesting discussion that needs to be had, because you can think about that across any kind of marginalised group, whether it's sexual marginalisation, racial, socio-geographic, anything. It's the people who actually have the privilege and the power and the money and the platform and the voice that need to speak for those who don't.
Yeah, totally. And I
understand what they're speaking about, obviously.
Yeah. And I think it's like owning and confronting, the really uncomfortable facts of the situation instead of denying them and pretending that it's all okay. And then having actual proper conversations about it, because otherwise it has to kind of boil up and bubble and bubble and bubble, and then it explodes, because essentially, you if you have this history in any country with an indigenous or religious group that is a minority group or have been oppressed for whatever reason, you, like humans, this is what Brene was saying, that humans innately cannot hurt other humans. The only way we can do it is if we make them less than ourselves. So, to put you above anyone that, like if for you to abuse anyone, you have to put them below you. If it's a whole group of people, then you put them below your group of people, and that way you can then actually treat them, in your head, you can actually treat them poorly.
That's so interesting. And, I've been just hearing you speak, because you and I have had countless discussions over years about sort of authenticity, owning our own stories, being true to who we are as individuals, expressing our truth. You and I both know that that's been a massive part for ourselves of our own growth. And I kind of think we value that. And I love what Brene Brown talks about, vulnerability and owning our own personal stories. And it's such an interesting concept to apply to a society or a story about a group of people, because that really does shift and change everything. I have this discussion a lot around racism, because I'm asked to be on a lot of diversity panels, right?
Is that because
I'm half Japanese, and what's it like to be sort of, not white in the media. And in fact, I've stopped doing that a lot, because I'm like, well, if you want to talk to me about what it's like to run a marathon on, say, Sydney to Hobart, pop me on your panel, but don't pigeonhole me necessarily in a box. And I've thought about this a lot. And one of the difficult things with racism is that, how do I explain this? So, okay, a guy I spoke to many years ago had to change the gender makeup of his workforce, which was in engineering. He had to get it 50-50 men and women by a certain date. Bear in mind, engineering is very male-dominated, and 17% of graduates are women. So he's working from a shitty base anyway. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on your podcast, but he's got to somehow get 50% women in his workforce from a 17% graduate group. And so I asked him how he did it. He did it. And I said, how did you do it without marginalising and creating an atmosphere in your company of resentment of all the people?
And keeping the quality. Like if there's literally not enough women that have the credentials, how do you actually...
True. Quality. How do those women come into the workforce without feel like they're token tick box? How do the people who have been kicked out? Is there a culture of resentment because, well, I'm not woman and I'm not under 30, so I'm not useful? Like, how do you manage all that? And he said a lot of people make the problem of having a strategy, like no racism, whatever it is. We're not going to be racist. We're going to be inclusive, or we're going to include everyone, and we're going to have these kinds of targets. But they don't allow the people who have the most to lose a voice. So he said what he did was, for the first year, is he spoke to, so I'm thinking about this with the race stuff. He spoke to all the people in his organisation who had the most to lose, men of a certain age, generally white. He let them express their fears. I don't know if I'm going to be able to send my kids to school. Does this mean I'm not valued anymore? I've been here for 30 years and suddenly I feel redundant. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm scared, whatever it was. He let everyone express how they felt. Then he explained to them why this had to happen, the world that we're living in now, and why it was necessary, how for their company to be modern and integrate and be successful in the future. This is, so he then explained the strategy to everyone from a basis of hearing people. And so I've often thought about that in terms of voices. When people's fears, truths aren't expressed. So, for example, racism in Australia, we have this kind of like, either we're not racist, we are racist, but we don't want to really talk about it, but let's think of some strategies in a workplace to make sure that we're not racist. But what's not happening is the conversation of people going, I feel like crap because I feel marginalised or I feel not listened to. And I think that's where these boil-ups and tensions happen because people's voices haven't been heard.
They're not heard. Totally. I mean, you think of it in like personal relationships.
Yes.
You know, if I'm even in my family, I'll ask nicely again. And then once I'm not feeling heard, then it starts to boil. I have to raise my voice. I have to shout. Yeah. And thankfully I don't usually have to do more than just shout. But, you know, if you imagine like generations of not being heard and not being appreciated in society and not being valued in society, it's kind of like that voice of going, enough is enough, you know.
And this guy was talking on this Instagram thing this morning. He was saying, he had this really cool video on his own Instagram called something like uncomfortable questions with a black guy. Like, so all these white friends of his have been asking him questions and he was answering all their questions, like all the things you don't really want to ask a black person, but here you go, ask a black person. You know, can I call you black?
Can you give me the, do you know what that was? Just
I will.
In case people want to
it's
have a look at it.
Really cool. I'll find it while we're chatting. And one of the questions he said he's been asked the most the last week was, why are black people rioting and not just protesting? That was and he said, look,
I get it.
Protests and haven't worked. You know, we can take a knee, we can do things gently, he went through this whole history of stuff and he said,
and what's still happening, you know, like George Floyd got knelt on until he died, you know, like
exactly.
It hasn't worked. That's why, because what's been happening hasn't worked.
This guy, so the chat he had with Lily Reinhardt was on her Instagram.
Lily
Reinhardt, but his name is at Lemanacho. LEMANCHO. But if you go to his Instagram, so the chat with her is actually quite interesting because it kind of brings up that white privilege stuff. But if you go to his Instagram, he's got this really cool, you know, uncomfortable things you want to ask about.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'll put that in the show notes so people can go to that.
And so that in situations like that, I think, thank God for the media and the amplification of voices, images. Like without that image of George Floyd, this would never be happening.
Yeah. And again, hopefully it's enough hopefully, you know, the situation in America is just so sad, but hopefully it's a catalyst for change because something has to, you know, like it's that the voice is not being heard for just so long and so long and so long and so long, and something has to change.
And then I think about all that stress in amongst all the COVID stuff.
Oh, I know.
And then there's all these reports of like, you know, there might be more of a wave of COVID because all these people are gathering together now.
Oh, totally. And people have still lost jobs and businesses are being looted and, you know, are people feeling safe? And, you know, like it's horrific. And then the other thing I just wanted to touch on. What was that?
There's a global revolution.
Yes, totally. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Actually, on that point, I was listening to someone else saying, you know, like at some stage in the future we'll be talking about the pre-COVID days and, you know, how we used to shake hands. How crazy was that we used to shake hands because, you know, it's just it's like it's a funny thought to think about that, we're going to think in the future, we're going to think that was crazy to shake hands pre-COVID days.
Hands. I know, it's nuts, hey?
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to just touch on before, as in the last topic before we kind of wrap it up, is the difference in political leadership. Like, and it's like, and I don't want to get political at all, but personality-wise, energy-wise, it's like, you know, you look at, say, Donald Trump and, you know, the way that I look at his energy, it's like, and we've had these sort of conversations, and I know it's a bit airy-fairy, but it's just another interesting perspective. It's like Donald Trump kind of represents that energy of the immature, egotistic masculine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like him trying really hard to hold on to power, and all this stuff has to come up, definitely, but all this stuff coming up and all the crap that's just been sitting there, because this pattern of power in the US has, you know, pretty consistently been older, wealthy, white men. So there's that. And then look at the comparison with like a leader like Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah.
And it's like she's like this definition of, she can just hold this compassion and this love for her country and lead from her heart.
Yeah.
And being able to feel where everyone's at and still, you know, she's got this beautiful, like, feminine strength that she just holds it.
Wisdom, authenticity, strength without being... She's just got this amazing balance. And the interesting thing about that is, I mean, she's incredible and she was voted in. So it's kind of like one of those things that it takes a society to want someone like that to be their leader, right? So she didn't win that position through money, or, you know, the presidential way of becoming a president is so strange. She won through a proper election process where electorate goes, yeah, she's the person. So I think it says a lot about New Zealand as a culture and a society.
And where they were at and how ready they were.
Look at the way in which that country has the treaty with the Maoris.
I was going to say, and how they've actually dealt with their history.
Yeah. So I think she's the most incredible leader. And I also think New Zealand itself is a really special place to want a leader like her in power. And you look back at the history of that country, and there's something very different about the values that country has placed on people and people's voices and people's right to be heard and people's right to have...
And their history and owning the story and having those uncomfortable conversations and trying to make it right into the future so it's better for everybody.
Exactly.
Australia and America could learn, I mean, and probably lots of other parts of South Africa, you know, could just learn so much about, you know, like that balance from her.
Yeah, 100%. But there needs to be the uncomfortable real conversations for, I think, a culture and a country to get to the point where that's the kind of leader they want at the norm. And I don't think that happens overnight, unfortunately. I think that's decades and generations of courage.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, courage and, definitely courage. Courage and responsibility, like personal responsibility. And
in fact, we live in a society or a world where we live for our own, what we want now, what we want in a week's time, in a year's time. But something like that takes generations that you might never see the result. So it's kind of like, are we willing as a society to work for something that we might never see, but our grandkids might, but believe that that's the outcome that we want? Because I think it takes 3 generations to generally shift anything major. Like you look at poverty, a lot of talk about Indigenous poverty is kind of like it takes 3 generations to really shift something massive. And that's on average 70 years.
Yeah, wow.
Right? So if you think about just a family or a sort of unit like that, you think then about a country and a culture of a country that, say, in Australia is now 200 and something years of white settlement. So how do you shift deep cultural ingrained ways of us thinking and being? It doesn't happen overnight. And I suppose Black Americans kind of know that, right? Because they've been fighting since the 60s, at least very actively. And that's 2 generations, 3 generations. We're in the 3rd generation now. So that's actually quite interesting.
That is interesting.
If you think about it in that way. I often think 3 generations. Hong Kong is a really interesting phrase. It's in Cantonese, but it sort of translates as the first generation works for it and earns it. The second generation's grateful for it. The 3rd generation wastes it, right? So you've got a guy who set up his noodle shop, works 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, to make the family sustainable. The son or daughter growing up in that environment sees their father and mother working constantly to feed them, to get them maybe to school for the first time in any generation of that family. The third generation reaps the privilege of wealth, and they've never really
seen the
hard work, and so they kind of waste it. And so there's this kind of...
And then what? And then it starts to fall apart a little bit.
Fall apart, and maybe it starts again. But the kind of the ideal is that third generation somehow understands the first and second generations in order to develop it. But there's something about generational stuff. So I think there would be something interesting to delve into around what's happening in the States and look at it on a...
It would be really interesting to delve into, like, you know, that in lots of different places around the world, lots of different cultural and religious sort of minority groups and stuff like that. That would be really fascinating. That's probably another chat.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Kum, for having this conversation with me.
My pleasure.
Nice to talk to you as usual.
Have a great day.
Before we go, can you just tell people if they want to start following you, or where the best place to follow you is?
Sure. I'm probably most active on Instagram, I guess, and that's at kumikotag, so Kumikotag.
Okay. Yeah.
So good to see you, Sarah.
And anything else? Twitter? Are you on Twitter a lot? Or
I'm at Twitter at Kumi Taguchi, but I don't tweet a lot these days.
Okay. And what about Facebook? Is that just personal, or?
No, I think I've got a work one. I think it's Kumi Taguchi Official or something like that.
Okay.
But I'm not on there much either.
All right. Well, I'll have a look at. Have a look. And
all right.
Good to talk to you. Love you lots.
Love you. Have a good day.
Thank you. If you loved or learnt something in this episode, share it. And don't forget to subscribe. I look forward to bringing you next week's Awakening Conversation. Have a wonderful week.